In 2004, a woman walked into a police station and told an unbelievably shocking story. She confessed that she was a member of an incestuous satanic cult, and she had been taking part in absolutely vile and horrific rituals. She also confessed to participating in an elaborate plot to kill her husband. This was a bizarre story, to say the least, but none of it was actually true. However, the truth was almost just as disturbing. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Summer Sanchez, and on this channel we talk about crime cults and heinous history. So if that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. I'm happy to finally be back. It's been a while since I posted. Some of you saw my community update, so you already know this, but the first week of February, we went on vacation. And a few days after we got back, I got the flu. I got super sick. My fever got up to like 103. I was coughing my face off. It was terrible. So I finally got over the flu and my voice was to a point where I could actually, record. But then something even worse happened. Our 17-year-old dog, Marlin, passed away on February 20th. Many of you who have been watching me for a while, or, if you follow me on Instagram, you've seen Marlin. He's made appearances on this channel before. My husband and I got him when we were very young. We feel like, we grew up with him pretty much. He was around for, our engagement, college graduation, all four of our kids' births, moves across the country. He was a very important and central part to our family. And it was probably the worst day of my life, I think. Probably so far. It's just been super sad over here, and I need to hold it together so that I can film this video. As hard as the situation was, he did go very peacefully, so I'm very thankful for that. I don't remember life without him, so it's gonna be really weird trying to adjust to not having him here. It's already been strange, he's not in his normal places where he, like curls up. I keep his bed right by my desk, and that's where he always was. Like, anytime I was working, filming, like anytime I was recording a video, he was sitting either on my lap during those videos or he was right by my feet. It's just going to be a weird adjustment, and I know we're going to get through it, and each day will get better and better. Right now it's very hard, but I am trying. I knew I needed to, throw myself into something just to distract my brain. Been focusing on, getting this video out, and I think that's kind of what I need. I need some mental distractions. Not trying to, dump all of this trauma on you or anything, but you guys are my community, and when something big happens in my life that, especially something that impacts my channel directly, I want you to know about it. And when something big, like bad and traumatic like that happens in my life, it completely halts production on this channel because I do everything. So if I'm out, there's nothing getting done. But all that to say, unless something insane happens, I don't see why I wouldn't be on my normal upload schedule. I just hope that next month is better than this month has been. Today's case is a really weird one. We're talking about the bizarre case of the Hamlin family. But before we get into that, let's go ahead and briefly talk about today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by June's Journey. June Parker is shocked by the devastating news that her sister has been murdered by her husband. June sets out from her home in England back to her childhood home on Orchid Island to try to get more answers, and she quickly discovers that there's much more to this story. Follow along as June conducts her own investigation into the murders. And even though she doesn't have all of the investigative tools that the detectives have at their disposal, she uses her charm, intelligence, and confidence to uncover tons of important clues and family secrets. You'll progress through the game by finding hidden objects within beautifully designed scenes, and the game is set back in the 20s, so from the visual aesthetic down to the music, the entire game has that 1920s vintage charm, which I absolutely adore. As you complete each scene, you will find clues and unlock cutscenes, and slowly you'll begin to put the pieces together and solve the mystery. I love the storyline. The main objective of the game, of course, is to solve the murders, but you'll also explore things like love, betrayal, and family relationships. And the story is constantly evolving, with new chapters launching every week. And you can test your detective skills right now by finding the hidden clue on the screen. Here's a riddle to help you along. If J equals 10 and P equals 16, what does 6, 15, 15, 20, 16, 18, 9, 14, and 20 mean. You can pause the video to take more time. Now let's see how you did. The hidden clue is a footprint, and it's a crucial find in the murder investigation. I absolutely adore June's Journey. I've been playing for years now, and I can attest to the fact that there is always more to the story, there are always new scenes to explore, and I have yet to get bored with this game. So if you're searching for a fun, relaxing game, look no further and download June's Journey today for free by clicking the link in my description box or scanning the QR code on the screen. June's Journey is available on iOS and Android mobile devices as well as PC. A huge thank you to June's Journey for the continued support on this channel, and now let's get into the case. On February 26, 2004, 47-year-old Susan Hamlin and her husband, 44-year-old Richard, walked into the El Dorado police station in California with a wild story. Susan told police that she was there to turn herself in. She confessed that she was a high-ranking member of a satanic cult led by her father. She said she had been abusing her children and sleeping with her father as part of a satanic ritual. And she also confessed to taking part in an elaborate plot to kill her husband, Richard.
My family was in a Satan church, and I've been a Satan worshiper. He told me that I needed to take accountability for molesting my kids.
So the detectives are listening to all of this, and they are shocked and confused by what they're hearing. This was a crazy story. Satanic cults, murder plots, it sounded insane. As Susan was talking, the police noticed that she had bruises on her face. She had obviously attempted to cover them up, but they could see that she had been beaten up recently. Susan was really showing a lot of signs of being the victim of domestic violence, and so the police weren't really sure that they could trust the story that she was telling them. Is she making this all up? Is she being forced to tell them all of this? Where does Richard come into all this? Is he a part of it? Now, while Susan was being questioned, the police had secretly sent word for CPS to go to the Hamlin home and pick up their 4 children just until they could figure out what the hell was going on here. So they finished gathering all of the information and taking down Susan's account, and once she was done telling them everything, to her surprise, they just let her go. They didn't take her into custody. She wasn't under arrest. They told her that they had the kids removed from the home and they were going to be doing a thorough investigation before any arrests were made. And so Susan and Richard were just sent home. Detectives immediately started digging into the lives of the Hamlins and interviewing the children, and what they discovered painted a very, very disturbing picture. So Richard and Susan Hamlin were both lawyers. They had been married for almost 20 years. They had met in law school. Susan was a quiet, reserved person, where Richard was pretty loud and outgoing. And as soon as they met, there was an instant attraction. You know, it was kind of like an opposites attract situation. Susan truly thought that she had found her perfect person. She referred to Richard as her Prince Charming. The two of them got married after just 6 months, and they graduated law school, they passed the bar, and they began their careers in law. They were both extremely successful lawyers, quickly making a name for themselves, and they were making a ton of money. They were even able to build their dream home in El Dorado Hills, a very nice upscale area in the greater Sacramento region. And this house was very, very nice. This was $1 million home. Susan and Richard started their family, and they welcomed their first child, a son named Ryan. And Susan and Richard really seemed to have it all. You know, they had seemingly a great relationship. They were extremely successful. They were making tons of money, living lavishly. But there was one thing that plagued their relationship from the very beginning, and that was the rocky relationship between Richard and Susan's dad, Dr. Sidney Seymour. Richard and Sidney did not get along at all. The animosity, as far as I can tell from the research, seemed to mostly come from Richard. Susan had always been very close with her father, and Richard was not okay with their relationship. He was jealous of how close Susan and Sidney were. If Susan ever asked her dad for his opinion on something, it really upset Richard. He didn't like that Sidney had any influence over Susan. And it really bothered him if Sidney would hug Susan or put his arm around Susan. He viewed Susan as his, and the fact that she had another man in her life that was important to her really got under Richard's skin. Susan has said that it was like Richard felt that he was in constant competition with her father over who she loved more. And as the years went on, the relationship between Sydney and Richard just got more and more strained. But aside from that one issue, granted, it was a pretty big issue, Susan and Richard did seem to have a pretty solid relationship, in the beginning at least. They went on to have 3 more children. They had another son named Alec, and they had 2 daughters, Claire and Jennifer. And the family was doing so well financially. Richard alone was pulling in over $700,000 a year. So they decided that they could just make it work on Richard's income alone. And so at Richard's request, Susan stepped away from her own law career to stay home with the kids. Definitely seems like Richard was the main catalyst for this. I don't know how much Susan really wanted to do this, but either way, Richard became the sole breadwinner and Susan stayed home with the children. They would have parties at their home. The kids remembered having these really elaborate, fun birthday parties with lots of food and swimming and karaoke, and Richard was always there to make sure that everyone was having a good time. The family was very active in the community. They went to church together every Sunday. They just seemed like the picture perfect family. But around the time that Richard turned 40, the family dynamic started to change. Richard became very controlling and demanding of Susan. It's thought that he was going through a midlife crisis around this time, and he started acting very erratically. This, of course, caused Susan and Richard to struggle in their marriage. Things were starting to become pretty strained between them. Richard was more agitated, especially with Susan. Like, nothing she ever did was right. He would yell at her in front of the kids all the time. And Susan felt trapped, because she was no longer working. The balance of power in the relationship had really shifted more in Richard's favor. Susan was made to feel like she had to give in to all of Richard's demands all the time. She felt less independent because she was no longer practicing law. She didn't have her career anymore. And so now Richard has become this really high-powered attorney, and she was made to feel lesser than because, she was just a mom. I think that Richard's plan all along, and the reason why he pushed for Susan to walk away from her own career, was specifically to make her feel this way, to feel like she couldn't leave, to make her feel more dependent on him. Richard really wanted Susan to be the perfect trophy wife. He wanted Susan to be the perfect wife and mother by day and a sexually submissive woman by night. He wanted Susan to be available to him sexually whenever he wanted. As the wife, she should just drop everything she was doing to satisfy him. Never mind the fact that she was taking care of everything at home, keeping the house together, raising 4 kids, cooking, cleaning, and doing everything else in between. He was the man of the house. He felt like he was entitled to sex whenever he wanted it, even when Susan was exhausted or just simply didn't want to. And if Susan ever vocalized that she did not want to be intimate, Richard would try to make her feel like there was something seriously wrong with her, like mentally there was something wrong. And this situation was kind of the catalyst for the horrific things that go on to happen in this story. Because Susan didn't want to constantly have sex like Richard did, he started to suggest that there were sinister reasons why her sex drive wasn't as high as he thought it should be. And this is when the brainwashing began. Richard suggested to Susan that she had been molested by her father as a child, and that caused her to not want to have sex as an adult. Now, Susan 100% denied that she had ever been abused by her father, but Richard insisted that this is actually what happened to her, that she had been molested by her father, but she just didn't remember because she had repressed the memories, and he was going to counsel her so that she could finally bring these horrible memories out. Richard started scouring through family photos, and he was just going through and meticulously analyzing every detail on these photos, searching desperately for some sign that he could prove that Sydney had actually molested Susan as a child. He would find photos of Susan with her dad, totally innocent, normal photos, and he would twist them to be something disgusting. For example, there was a photo of Susan and her dad together, and in this photo, her dad was looking at her. And Richard would say, "See, look at that expression on your father's face. He's looking at you in a sexual way." There was another photo of Susan and her friends when she was a kid. She had had a sleepover, and someone had taken a photo of the girls sleeping at the sleepover. And Richard twisted that photo to be something sinister as well. For one thing, they didn't even know who took that photo, but he insisted that it had been Sydney that took the photo. He said, "See, he's a predator. What kind of person would take a photo of a bunch of girls sleeping?" Again, this was a totally innocent photo. Nothing nefarious was going on whatsoever. But no matter how much Susan protested. No matter how many times she told Richard that this just was not true, Richard would not accept it. He would just push harder and harder, and these counseling sessions, which he referred to as memory sessions, were happening all the time. And these sessions would last for hours, literally sometimes from sundown to sun up. Richard would be questioning Susan. He would be presenting photo after photo, twisting it to fit this totally false narrative and insisting that Susan needed to unlock these repressed memories of abuse. But Susan just couldn't do it because it didn't happen. This whole thing was created in Richard's mind, and it completely consumed him. It's all he could think about. And unfortunately, Richard would not give up on this quest to ruin Susan's relationship with her father. And he started to get very aggressive, and these memory sessions became more like violent interrogations instead of counseling sessions. Richard became extremely paranoid. He stopped allowing anyone in the house to answer the phone. Visitors were no longer in the house, like the kids couldn't have friends over. He was trying to cut his family off from the outside world. And he also started introducing drugs into the memory sessions as well. He would force Susan, who had never done drugs before in her life, to snort cocaine during the sessions in an attempt to open her mind and make her remember. Now, Richard himself was also doing drugs around this time, and I'm sure that that added to whatever psychological issue that he was obviously dealing with during this time, and it probably just made the paranoia even worse. Eventually, Richard introduced weapons into the sessions. He would sit with a gun pointed at Susan while he interrogated her. He also had a sword, and he would swing the sword around at her while he was questioning her. He would pin her against the wall with the sword pointed at her chest, and he was convinced that because Susan wouldn't unlock the repressed memories of her father's abuse, that meant that she was on her father's side. Again, it just all comes back to Sydney versus Richard and this imaginary competition that Richard had dreamed up. Susan would not admit what Sydney had done to her, so that meant that she was on Sydney's side, which meant that she was not on Richard's side. And this absolutely enraged Richard, and this is when the physical abuse really ramped up. Richard started beating Susan multiple times per week, sometimes 5 days a week. He broke multiple bones. He left bruises on her face and body. He would break furniture over her body. And eventually, the physical abuse, the isolation, the brainwashing, it all became so intense, and Susan couldn't take it anymore. Up to that point, she had continued to deny that her father had done anything inappropriate to her as a child, but she finally broke. During one of the memory sessions, she remembered one night when she was a child, her friend was sleeping over at their house. She said she woke up and saw her father sitting near her friend, and he looked at Susan and told her to go back to sleep. And this was Richard's aha moment. This was his gotcha moment. In his mind, this was proof that Sydney was a predator, and he had been molesting Susan's friend that night. And what did he do with this breakthrough information? Well, he decided to sue Susan's father, Sydney, for abusing Susan as a child, thus causing her to have a subpar sex drive. This once prominent lawyer was now suing his father-in-law for having an incestuous relationship with his wife and ruining her sex drive. It's absolutely insane. Even after all of my research into this case, I still don't know for sure if Richard actually believed these things or if this literally was just a plan to take down Sydney and make some money along the way. But whatever the reason, Richard completely threw himself into this lawsuit. He worked day and night. He continued the memory sessions where he would just, continue to brainwash Susan even further. Her mind was completely under Richard's control at this point, and Richard was loving every minute of this. He had finally successfully turned his wife against her father, and now he was going to set out on a campaign to completely ruin Sydney's reputation. Sydney was well known in his community. He had a PhD in agriculture, and Richard wanted to completely destroy his community's view of him. But the insanity does not stop there, because now we have to talk about the satanic cult. During one of the memory sessions, Richard found a box of Susan's keepsakes, and in that box were some letters from her father. And Richard spent hours and hours studying every aspect of the letters, trying so hard to pinpoint little patterns or any kind of secret message within the letters. And he eventually discovered what he thought was a secret code, and somehow he connected that code to a satanic cult. So now not only was Sydney a predator, he was also the leader of a powerful secret satanic cult. Richard said this cult was full of predators who passed children around to be abused. He said that they would have these really insane sex parties where children would be passed around as some form of ritual. He also convinced Susan that her father used her in MK Ultra experiments, and in 1982, she had been taken somewhere by the cult and forced to watch the making of a snuff film where she witnessed a girl being killed. And according to Richard, she did this while, quote, she was naked and tied to a pegboard. He also said that Susan was subject to beatings, electroshock, sensory, food, and sleep deprivation during this time. He was just pulling this insane stuff out of thin air. And since Susan's mind was completely under his control by this point, whatever Richard said, she believed. She did not remember any of this, but that was just because she had repressed all those memories because they were just too horrific. Richard sat his kids down and he told them that they were no longer allowed to see their grandparents because their grandfather was a pedophile and, a member of the satanic cult, and he completely cut off any communication between his family and Susan's family. Now, as you can imagine, because Richard has completely lost it, his practice was not doing very well. Richard was drinking a ton, he was doing drugs, he was focusing the majority of his time on these memory sessions and building a case against Sydney. And so in 2003, to save money, he moved his law office to the family home, which meant that he had even more time to conduct sessions and beat his wife. It meant that there was no escape for Susan and the kids because Richard was now home all the time. By this point, Susan was fully cooperating with the lawsuit because, like I said, she now believes everything Richard is saying. They just continue to unlock more and more memories in preparation for an inevitable court battle where Susan would have to get on the stand and testify about her father's abuse. And one day, while they were going through old photos, just like they always did, Richard came across a photo of his children with Sydney. And he completely lost it because he took the innocent photo of Sydney with his grandchildren as proof that Sydney had also molested them. He started screaming at Susan that this was her fault. She let her father do this to the kids, just completely freaking out. And then, in the midst of all this chaos, a light bulb went off in Richard's mind. Susan was in on the entire thing. She was not a victim. She was part of the cult. She was a willing participant in the abuse. She was a high-ranking member of the satanic cult. She was actually aspiring to become a high priestess in the cult. And she was going to achieve her high priestess role by having an incestuous relationship with her father and allowing Sydney to abuse their children. But Richard took it even further and he accused Susan of also abusing her own children. Susan was horrified. She did not remember doing any of this. She did not remember being a part of a cult. She didn't remember any of the incestuous stuff with her father, and she definitely did not remember ever hurting her children. But she assumed that it must be true, just like everything else. And she just kept apologizing. That's all she could really do. And in that moment, everything changed. Susan was no longer a victim. She was one of Richard's worst enemies. He grabbed Susan and dragged her into the kitchen where the kids were, and he forced her to confess what she had done to them. And that's exactly what she did. She looked her children in the eye and she confessed that she had molested them and that she had let her father molest them. And she just kept apologizing. Now, the kids had no idea what was going on, and they did question things a little, but you got to remember their lives were completely chaotic, and what was happening in their house they thought was normal at this point. This had been going on for a long time. Their dad had been telling them all kind of crazy stuff, and like Susan, they believed it. Alec did speak up in this moment, and he said, "I don't remember my mom touching me inappropriately." But Richard said, "Oh, you just don't remember because you're so traumatized. You've repressed those memories." Now, Susan was completely ostracized from the rest of the family. Richard had turned everyone against her. She was completely alone in that house. And the kids felt totally betrayed by their mom. They have said that during that time, they didn't have any sympathy for her because they thought she was evil because that's what their father was telling them. After that day, Susan was treated more like a prisoner in the home. No one would talk to her. where Richard would lock her inside of her bedroom for the bulk of the day, and she would only be let out to clean or cook dinner for everyone. She was still being beaten all the time, and Richard started telling the kids that he was beating the demons out of her. Not only is she being cut off from her children and the rest of her family, she's also having to come to terms with the fact that she herself is a pedophile. Even though she really hasn't done anything, she believes that she has. This was an all-time low for Susan, and things were going to get so much worse before it was all over. Now, Susan's extended family, like her dad, her mom, and she also had two sisters, they had been cut off for a while now, but they didn't really understand the full scope of why, until Sydney received a letter from Susan. In the letter, Susan was accusing Sydney of all of these horrific things. Richard had forced Susan to write that letter, and not only that, but he also had flyers made, literally calling Sydney a pedophile, and then he posted them all around the neighborhood. This was kind of the final straw for Sydney, and he ended up filing a restraining order against Susan and Richard. This had to be a total nightmare for Sydney because his own daughter, who he was always super close to, is now accusing him of unspeakable things. She won't talk to him. He's been cut off from his grandchildren as well. And now everything is on display for the community to see. All of these horrible things about him that just weren't true. But Richard took this restraining order as a sign of Sydney's admitted guilt. He was like, see, he's guilty. He's trying to run away from the allegations with this restraining order. And this was all just fuel to the fire. Richard was out for blood, and he continued to work on this case against Sydney. In an attempt to collect even more memories, Richard suggested that Susan reconnect with a childhood friend named Lisa Klum. Lisa and Susan had been friends throughout middle school and high school, and Richard thought that she might be helpful in filling in some of the memory gaps that Susan seemed to have. So Susan calls up Lisa, they reconnect and they make plans to meet up. And of course, Richard was there the entire time because Susan was not allowed to be alone with anyone at this point. He does not let Susan out of his sight. And of course, he wants to be there to control the conversation. Lisa hadn't seen Susan in a really long time, and I believe this was her first time to meet Richard. And she immediately got a bad feeling. He was extremely cocky and he did most of the talking, and she just got the feeling that something was not right. During this meeting, Richard just came out and told Lisa that Susan's father had abused her as a child, and they were looking for someone who knew Susan as a child to help her piece together the blank spaces in her memory. Now, Lisa seems to be a pretty perceptive person, and she quickly realized that Susan seemed to be under Richard's control. Like I said, Richard was doing most of the talking, and Susan was just nodding along with whatever he said. And I'm sure Lisa probably saw some bruises on Susan as well. So Lisa is thinking to herself, she really needs to figure out what's happening here and help Susan in any way she can. And so she agrees to help Susan fill in these gaps in her memory because she wanted Richard to think that she was on their side. She was someone that they could trust. But she was actually just planning to get closer to Susan and potentially help her to escape. Over the next several weeks, Lisa and Susan would have daily phone conversations, and, Richard encouraged this because he thinks that Lisa's working with them in this lawsuit. They would talk about the old days. They would discuss memories that Susan supposedly had. Lisa did attempt to discredit some of these memories. She would say, Susan, that can't be true because I was there when this happened, and, your father never did anything to us. Eventually, Lisa convinced Susan to come to church with her and talk to her pastor about all of this stuff. And Susan, surprisingly, agreed. Now, during the meeting, the pastor just flat out asked Susan if Richard was beating her, and she said yes. The pastor told her, that's not right. You really need to get out of this relationship. This kind of gave Susan something to think about. And before she left, she grabbed some pamphlets about domestic abuse and she brought them home with her, and she hid them inside of some cookbooks. She thought that Richard would never find them in there, but eventually he did end up finding them, and he went absolutely ballistic. And from that moment on, Lisa was now considered an enemy. She was a member of the cult. She was working with Sydney. All of this made Richard even more paranoid than he already was. He had completely lost his mind. And one day, Lisa called Susan and she asked her if she wanted to attend church service with her. When Susan got off the phone, Richard went absolutely crazy. He accused Susan of actually conspiring with Lisa over the phone, and they were plotting to kill him. He thought that Susan and Lisa and Sydney and the rest of the cult members were all planning to get together and kill Richard. They were going to lure him somewhere, like Lisa's church, and they were going to sacrifice him as a Christian trophy. This new insane theory just pushed Richard even further towards the edge. The isolation got more intense, the beatings got more intense. Richard's violence towards Susan reached a point that Susan almost didn't make it out alive. He started pistol whipping her, he would tase her, he would drag her by her hair in front of the children and beat her relentlessly. He also stabbed her in the head with pins. And if Richard knew that he had really hurt Susan in a particular area of her body, like if he had broken a bone, like a rib or something, he would deliberately target those spots on her body again and again just to inflict as much pain as possible. Susan at this point was literally being tortured. He was demanding to know the details of this murder plot, where it was happening, what was the signal, but Susan couldn't tell him anything because there was no plan to murder him. It was just more delusions. And then one day, Lisa called Susan's cell phone again, and Richard saw that it was Lisa calling, which already sent him into high alert, right? Because, she's in this massive plot to kill him. But as Lisa was calling, someone rang the doorbell. So Richard took this as a sign that this was it. This must be the signal. Lisa was calling Susan to let her know that the killer cult hitman was at their front door. So he lets Susan answer the door, and he's kind of hiding, waiting to see who this person is. Standing right there on the front doorstep was two women. They were two Jehovah's Witnesses. They were just going door to door and handing out watchtowers, which are, their little pamphlets that they hand out. And Susan just politely told them that they weren't interested. They said, okay, thank you, and they left. But Richard did not believe that these were actually just Jehovah's Witnesses. He was convinced that these two women were assassins. So he grabbed his gun and he ran out the front door. And now Susan is freaking out because she knows that these women are not assassins. She knows that they're just regular women, and she is terrified at what Richard is about to do. And then she hears a gunshot, and she immediately thought the worst. Now, thankfully, Richard had not shot either of the women. He had actually shot himself. As he was running out of the house, the gun went off and he shot himself in the leg. But that was not the story that Richard told. He said that there must be snipers positioned in the distance, and one of them must have shot him in the leg. The kids fully believed this story. They thought that Grandpa's satanic cult assassins had tried to kill their father. The police were called, an ambulance was called, and Richard was taken to the hospital. And police are trying to figure out what happened here. And right away, they knew that something was off about Susan. She had visible bruises on her. She looked very disheveled. But when they asked her if her husband was hurting her, she said no. And there wasn't really much they could do at that point. Richard was released from the hospital the next day, and he immediately went right back into his paranoid, chaotic state. He barricaded the doors and windows and stood guard with his guns. He even gave his sons guns as well. The younger son, Alec, was only 12 years old at the time, and he was handed a loaded gun and told to stand guard. That night, Richard interrogated Susan once again about Lisa Clum and the murder plot. And when Susan wasn't giving him the information that he wanted to hear, he grabbed his sword and he started waving it around. Now, he had done this before. He had pinned Susan against the wall with the sword before. This was nothing really new. But this time, Richard actually tried to kill Susan with the sword. She was lying on the bed, and she managed to roll away right before Richard stabbed a sword in the exact spot on the bed where she had been laying. She barely missed being stabbed with that sword. So the next morning comes, and Richard has devised a plan. Susan wasn't giving him the information that he wanted. He's sick and tired of just sitting and waiting for the cult to come and kill him. And so he decided that he's going to go find Lisa Clum, and he's going to kill her before she can kill him. And he enlisted the help of his two sons, Ryan and Alec. He ordered his sons to grab their paintball guns. He told them to freeze the paintballs so that, it would inflict maximum damage. Richard grabbed one of his guns. He also grabbed a knife and a taser. He got Lisa's address and directions to her house off of MapQuest. He then forced his kids and Susan into the car. The two girls were dropped off at school that morning, and the two boys and Susan and Richard set out to find Lisa Clum. Susan was the one in the driver's seat, and Richard was assaulting Susan the entire time she was driving. He was punching her in the head and the face. They searched for quite a while, but they just couldn't find Lisa's house. Maybe MapQuest directions weren't accurate or something. Maybe Richard had the wrong address. I don't know, but they never ended up finding Lisa's house. And this really pissed Richard off because in his twisted mind, this was just Susan's fault. She was once again proving that she was working for the cult and trying to protect Lisa. And he tells Susan to pull over near an empty field, and he forced her out of the car at gunpoint. Richard brought Susan into the field and he ordered her to get down on her knees, and he pointed the gun at her head and he asked her if she was ready to die. In that moment, Ryan and Alec truly thought that their mother was going to die. Their dad was finally going to kill her. But for whatever reason, in the end, Richard decided not to kill Susan that day. He told her to get up and he ordered her to get back in the car, and they just drove home. And thankfully, this nightmare is about to finally come to an end because Richard decided that it was time to go to the police with all of this information. He was going to force Susan to confess everything. Everything about the cult, the abuse of the children, the incest, the murder plot, all of it. So on February 26th, Richard drove Susan down to the police station and she confessed to all of these lies.
My family was in a Satan church and I've been a Satan worshiper. He told me that I needed to take accountability for molesting my kids.
Now, like I said in the beginning of the video, the police knew that something wasn't right with this confession, and they also realized that they were just at Susan and Richard's house a few weeks ago from the incident where Richard shot himself in the leg. They were already suspicious that there was some sort of domestic violence happening in the home, and now they're hearing this insane story, and they just did not believe it. Susan 100% seemed like a victim. So, like I said, the kids were put into CPS custody, and Susan and Richard were sent home to wait for the police to finish their investigation. During the investigation, the kids were all questioned separately, and each one of them told the same story. They had been abused by their mother, but they also said that they did not remember it happening, that their father had just told them that it happened.
Have you ever seen your mom do anything like that to like your little sister or to any of your brothers before?
Everything was completely changed within the matter of a few hours for me. Growing up and thinking that my mother was a horrible human being, and then hearing that in reality it was my father that was the monster was very rattling.
I remember just sitting there shocked.
She had done some pretty bad stuff to us.
Okay. Is that what he told you, or do you remember this?
That's what he told me.
And I'm just realizing, holy crap, this was all a sham.
They also told the police all about the abuse that was happening at the home, that Richard was beating up on their mother. And this was enough for Richard to be picked up on domestic violence charges.
Can't tell you how many people are frightened to death of you right now.
Frightened to death of me?
Yes.
I know it sounds crazy, but plan to have me whacked off here after she leaves with the kids to take him down to a satanic group and be part of this satanic church.
Once Susan knew that Richard was finally in custody and she heard everything that the kids had told the police, she felt like she could finally open up about what had been happening in the home. And she slowly began to realize that she had been brainwashed. The detectives did do an investigation into Sydney and the alleged cult, and they found absolutely nothing that corroborated any of Richard's claims. Susan was eventually reunited with her children, and they slowly started to put the pieces of the relationship back together. For years now, Susan had been the enemy within, and Richard was looked at as the hero. And now the kids had to come to terms with the fact that their dad was actually the bad guy and their mom was a victim. Richard was charged with 18 counts, but the most serious charge was torture, and it held a potential life term if he was found guilty. The trial started in October of 2005, and it lasted 3 months. Richard acted as his own attorney, which is crazy. I don't know how he was even found to be competent enough to stand trial because he was in such a state of delusion at that point. He claimed that Susan had been abused by her father, they were all a part of the satanic cult, and he denied that he ever laid a finger on Susan. He claimed that the bruises that Susan had on her body when this case broke, they were the result of the cult members beating her in an attempt to keep her from turning herself into police and exposing the cult. And in an insane moment of irony, Richard said, "I cannot explain what it feels like to have another person make false claims about you." 40 witnesses testified in the trial, including Susan herself and 3 of the children, and they said that they saw their father beat their mother nearly every day. The boys talked about the day Richard forced Susan out of the car and dragged her into the field, and how they truly thought their mother was going to die that day. In the end, Richard was found guilty on half of the charges brought against him, including the most serious charge of torture, which was really the most important charge. This meant that Richard could get a life sentence, which is exactly what he got. Richard Hamlin, former prominent, super successful attorney, was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. He has already been denied 3 times so far, so let's hope that he continues to be denied. Susan reconnected with her extended family, including her father, and they just kind of put the entire terrible experience behind them. And I sincerely hope that Susan and her children have healed from everything that Richard put them through. There's a short video of Susan talking about her experience here on YouTube, and I will leave a link to that and 2 short documentaries about this case down in the comments if you're interested. I found this case to be absolutely fascinating, and I also like that this is a survivor story. And that is all I have on this case. Let me know what you think about this one down in the comments. Don't forget to click the link in the description box or scan the QR code on the screen to download June's Journey for free. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and leaving me a comment. That is the easiest way for you to support me and my channel. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.